Welcome to the Oliver Miller Homestead for another episode of Down on the Homestead, featuring the events and activities of the Oliver Miller Homestead, situated just off the circle on Corrigan Drive in South Park. We try very hard to bring to life the activities and events that our ancestors in the 18th century would have taken part in. Today, our focus is on the women of the frontier, and you will learn so much about what contributions they made to enhance the survival and the comfort of their families. So come with me as we greet the women of the frontier. Obviously, one of the most important activities that the women had to do was feed their families. Here's Miss Janice, who will explain to us what she has planted here and how important it was.
Most of the things I plant are root vegetables because they last over the winter. And for storing them, they would put them in a barrel and lay them out and put hay in between all the layers so they wouldn't be touching. Now I have cabbage and lettuce, onions, potatoes, squash, turnips, beets, pole beans, spinach, carrots.
So, Miss Janice, where do you get the seeds that you'll need next year?
I saved them from the seeds from this year, and I put them in a very special place so no one touches them or we won't have food next year.
Okay, is there anything else we need to know about these foods?
Well, if I didn't have help from the children to weed the garden, we wouldn't have any food. So the children would help weed, and they would also be around so that the critters didn't eat our food.
Well, back in the 18th century, the women had a lot of strange-looking tools that we might not be familiar with now. So Miss Patty is going to explain the use of some of them. For example, exactly what is this?
That is a sugar cone. That's how you wouldn't get sugar in a bag, you'd get sugar in a cone. And then you'd use these little nippers to nip off the amount that you needed. And that was how you kept it.
And what is this then?
That's actually tea. That's what was thrown into Boston Harbor at the Boston Tea Party. And when you wanted to use it, you would just take your knife and shave some off and put it in your cup of hot water or your pot of hot water.
And going along with foods, what then is this?
That's a sausage stuffer. It would have made probably a lot of sausage from all the pieces and parts left over after they butchered an animal. So that's what that is.
Well, let me see. What about this little thing here? What would that be?
Yeah, that little very, very heavy thing is actually a bed warmer. It's a stone, and you would heat it in the fire, and then you could tuck it in between the sheets and warm up the bed on a winter night before you hopped in.
Very good. And this interesting little thing looks like a lollipop.
It's a darning egg. When you got a hole in your sock, you did not throw it away and go to Walmart and buy a new one. No, you would put this in so you'd have something hard to work against. And you would stitch, and you'd do your stitches in one direction, and then you'd do them in another direction and make a nice little patch in your sock. And the trick was to make it smooth so that if it was on the heel, you didn't give yourself a blister.
Well, I have one more question. What is that thing that looks like a torture chamber?
It does. That is a heckle. They would use this to clean the flax before they could make it into thread and then weave it into fabric. It was a long, hard process to make fabric. So clothes were highly valued and taken care of.
Is there anything else that's one of your favorites that you want to tell us about?
I kind of like the trencher. This is actually your plate because it was hard to carry china plates over the mountains. They tended to get broken. And so when your husband cut down a tree, he would make you some new plates and hollow out the center. And if the kids were good and finished their meal, which they pretty much always did, they could flip it over, and if you were lucky enough to have dessert, you had it on the back side.
And here's an excellent example of early recycling.
That's a mop. Whoop, I don't want to smack you with the handle. Yeah, that's the corn husk mop, and you would just soak it in some water and scrub your floor, and when one or more of them wore out, you just replaced it with a new one. Yeah, this one's kind of dried up. Needs a fresh corn husks.
I'm Sally, the granny midwife healer in general here on the frontier. Doctors were very rare every place. We certainly didn't have one out here, but there was a long folk tradition of how to look after one another. And generally the way the folk tradition worked is that when I was a young woman, I helped my grandmother, and then over time my grandmother did less and less and I did more and more. So most of the things I know what to do, I've learned from her. And most of the things I deal with recur pretty often. For instance, this is Maddie. She was helping her dad in the barn and a cow kicked her. She got a pretty good gash in her head and she broke her arm. So from what I learned from my grandmother, I made her a poultice of comfrey, which grows around everywhere. The other name for comfrey is knitbone, and it can be used both on a wound. She has some in for a broken arm and some in her headband. And I'm also making another poultice by smashing it, and I'll put a little hot water over it and replace the poultice pretty frequently. I can also make a tea out of it for her to drink. And the first couple of days I did, the first day or so, she was feeling pretty lousy. And in fact, rolled around in bed and I was afraid she'd hurt herself. And one of the few things we have out here, although we don't have much, is laudanum. And I did give her a couple of drips of laudanum, but I want to be very careful with that. It's expensive, we don't have much, but it does put a person to sleep. And today she's feeling a little better, and I don't think I want to give her that again, but there's a number of other things I'm giving her. Very regularly, we use chamomile tea. We also use other kinds of teas. This is feverfew, which dries and makes a very nice tea for people who are feverish. I also have some cattail pollen, which cattail pollen is really interesting because when she first was kicked by the horse, an open wound is dirty, and you want the wound to bleed as much as possible. So I'd put raw cattail pollen on it to make it bleed. And then after it bled enough to get reasonably clean, I would get toasted cattail pollen, which stops bleeding. And I would put it on then, and it did. It worked very well and stopped bleeding. And I do think that her swelling is going down. She still looks a little swollen, but she can see out of that eye, which she couldn't the other day. Other things that I might have to deal with besides wounds like that are cuts. People get hurt very often on the frontier, and they usually get hurt in a dirty kind of way. They cut themselves with their axes. People working in the kitchen cut themselves with knives. There too, knitbone might be used just because it's an all-purpose anesthetic. There are other kinds of things that you may hear about when you talk to the herb garden woman. She's a little better on some of those things than I am, although we work together. My other primary responsibility here is to be the midwife. Now, of course, this is a child. We don't need a midwife today. But midwifery, just like other kinds of healing, was learned from woman to woman. And when a woman felt her, I would visit her now and again during the time when she knew she was in the family way, and then eventually, when the time came, she would send somebody for me and I'd come to be there. Often there would be other people there, her own mother, her sisters, other women she trusted. It was very much a woman-centered thing. The advantage of having a midwife is experience. Every birth is a little different. I've seen many where the shape of the birth canal is different, the way the baby presents is different, the baby occasionally does get into trouble, and many of those troubles can be managed at home. Actually, catastrophic births are very uncommon on the frontier.
We're working here on a quilt for keeping us warm this winter. This is called a Dresden plate quilt, and it has a lot of little scraps. Every little piece that we save when we're making clothing or blankets or whatever we're working on, we always save the scraps, and then we can put them into a quilt and put them on a bed to keep us warm at night. The fabric that we're using could be cotton, it could be linen, it could be wool. Any of those, we'd have to get the cotton by trading for it, but the linen and wool we can produce right here. So often our quilts are made of that fabric. One of the things that we do with our young ladies, by the time they're 4 or 5 years old, they're old enough to thread a needle, and so they can sit under the quilt frame and thread needles for us, and that helps us get the quilt done faster. As they get a little bit past that skill, then they can come up and start to learn their stitches, and then pretty soon they're quilting right alongside us.
One of the important things that we did out here in the frontier was spinning fiber so that we could have that fiber woven and then make clothing out of it. Miss Michelle here is spinning wool. And tell us exactly what that process is all about, Miss Michelle.
So, in order to spin wool, the first thing you're going to have to do is shear the sheep in the springtime. And whenever you do that, the wool is going to be fairly dirty, so you're going to have to wash it, and then you're also going to have to make sure all the fibers are straightened out. So to do that, you're going to be using things called cards, which is going to get a lot of the dirt out and then also clean the wool to some extent and straighten out the fibers. After you card the wool, the next step would be to spin it. So here I have a spinning wheel, and I don't know if I can't do it one-handed, but the spinning wheel is twisting these fibers and turning that into a yarn. This yarn could then be measured in order to figure out how much the family had. Now, you wanted to make sure you measured how much you had so that you could know if you were going to have enough of the yarn for making cloth. There were a couple ways to measure this yarn. One of those ways was by using a niddy noddy, and that was just going to help you measure it out and figure out how much would be in a skein. Another way of measuring it was by using this thing called a weasel or a clock reel, and this was going to wind up the yarn as well. And the nice thing about the weasel is that as you twist it, it's going to eventually make a popping sound so that you could know how much yarn you've spun at that point. You wanted to know how much you had so that you could predict how much cloth you could then make for making the clothing. And a lot of times the women of the household would not actually weave the cloth, but they would have to have it woven. If you weren't near a town, then you would have a weaver stop at your house and weave the cloth for you. But otherwise, the woman of the household had to know then how much cloth, then how to turn that cloth into clothing. And it was going to be very important here on the frontier, because if you didn't have clothing, of course you were going to be cold and you'd probably die. And if you would wear just hides or skins, then you were going to be looked down upon by all of your neighbors. So that's going to be one of the reasons why spinning and then eventually weaving and making the clothing was going to be so important.
Well, here we are in the keeping room of what we call the Stone House. My mom, Mary Miller, is here to greet our guests today, along with my sister, Elizabeth McKee, who's traveled to visit us from up the St. Clair region. So they're going to tell us about what some of their travels were like and what life is like for them here on the frontier.
I remember coming over the mountains. We stumbled a lot. We came on what they now call the Indian trails. We were afraid because we didn't know what was in store for us. But we got here and it was all big trees and we had fun playing around them, but our mother and father had to clear the land and make our home.
Don't believe her, she didn't play much, she had work to do. The children were very important back then. They had to milk the cows and feed the chickens and clean after them. And that, so don't believe she played a lot. We knew we were home when we saw the stream down below, which is Catfish Creek. Even I had to remember the name of it. It's so new, but it was a clear water creek so that we could have water for our house. And then they ran through the, what's it called? Ran through the spring house? Spring house, thank you. When you get older, you forget things. Through the spring house, and we were able to capture some of it and build the spring house over it to maintain our vegetables and that all winter at a given temperature or a same temperature. And they always lasted real well.
We're here in the kitchen of our stone house and one of the most popular rooms in the house, obviously. We have a couple of our cooks making dinner for us today, and they'll be happy to tell you about how hard it was for them not only to cook but to gather the ingredients that they used.
Right now we have cornbread that's in the Dutch oven. We have coals on top and down below, and it's cooking. And we're cooking pork stew. Pork was the favorite meat of the settlers because what do you do with the pig except eat them? So when the little piglets are born, they run through the forest. Around September, all the farmers help gather each other's pigs because each farmer has a mark on the side of their ear. And they make bacon, ham, and sausage. Now last year we had a really hard summer because it rained, our crops were down, so it was a rough winter Fortunately, I managed to save some apples, and we have the pork, and so we're going to have those as a treat. We're also going to make apple fritters, so I know the men will come around for that, sure. I am Mary Miller. My husband is James, and he owns this house. And, you know, we've been here for quite a while. Oliver has passed right now. But we grow and use everything that we need on the farm. We have a vegetable garden, we have an herb garden. By the end of September or so, you'll see the ceiling filled with herbs. And I use those to flavor food, cover up the flavor of food, and for medicine. You know, there's no doctors, and we really don't trust doctors around here. So what we do is I have to know if somebody's got a dry cough or a phlegmy cough, what kind of a tea to make. If somebody has a cut or a burn, I have to know what kind of salve. The second leading cause of death for women was burns, and you can certainly see the way I'm dressed, even in the heat. We have all these layers of clothing. So we have to be really careful of infection. So we're afraid to get sick, and we're afraid to go hungry. I serve bread at every meal. Believe me, no matter what I've got in the pot, I can add bread and fresh churned butter, and everybody's happy because their little tummies are full. In the winter, that probably saved us a lot because I made a lot of bread. Cornbread is a big staple, but, you know, and we just put it in the bake oven. We can put about 18, 20 loaves of bread in that bake oven, and that'll get us through a couple days. You have to remember, there's, you know, I have my kids, my mother-in-law, my sister-in-law. We have a lot of people living in this house. So, you know, bread is a staple for all the meals.
So we're talking today about women on the frontier. And one of the big parts of frontier life is clothing. And so we have to start with the gardens where they're growing some of the flax. And we have a raw fleece over here. This is one that's been washed and we're starting to dye it. We are going to raise the sheep. Sheep are pretty hard to raise on the frontier. Most of the farms only had maybe 5 sheep. And so they used flax from the garden to make a combination linsey woolsey. And so we need a way now to get this fiber into a usable shape. So we'd have the children start to tear this fiber apart and get it ready to spin. Then we'd go over to the spinning wheel and we would make yarn. Then the yarn needs to be washed and stretched, and then it would be woven. And when you're all done, you've got a lot of off-white fabric. That gets old really quick. So we add another step, and that step is going to be dyeing. You can see that the motherwort is starting to take some color here. It starts off white. It goes to a tan, and with long boiling, it starts to pick up this dusty rose shade. So we've put in a new batch now of leaves to get more color. We used up all the color that was in the others, and so we are now putting this one in to get more color. This one, which is just starting to show the rose, but there's a lot of other colors that we can make. This is wool that's been washed but not dyed yet. We can get blues by using a plant called indigo. Also one that grows in the British Isles called woad. They both have the same chemical, indigotin, in them, only woad is only 1/9 as strong. And so we take these, and we have a really strange way of processing this. It's a gorgeous color of blue, but it's not water soluble. And so we have to do something really strange to it. They would save their old urine and then take the stale urine, mix it with wood ashes to make lye, and they would ferment it until all the color was out of it and it looks pale yellow. You dip the fiber in, pull it back out, it recombines with the oxygen in the air and turns blue. Takes about 50 dips to get to blue jean color blue. But that gave them a good blue. So if you ever see an old coverlet, you'll see that color of blue. We have goldenrod for yellow. Elderberries for purple. We could also use those black mulberries up there for a grayish purple. Madder root is what's going to make the regular soldier's red coat red, but it takes 40 days to change it from the yellow that you get from over, the orangey you get from over the fire, because you can't get the heat over 140 degrees, and fires tend to get hot where they want. So we're going to go through a 40-day process. They put it in sheep dung, they stick it in lime, they stick it in urine, they stick it in all sorts of stuff. By the time those poor soldiers get those coats, it has been through the ringer. The officers, on the other hand, got a very fancy red. Now this I cooked in a copper pot, it changes the color, but this is cochineal. This is actually a bug that grows on cactus that was a major part of trade. And if you do this in a tin pot at the right temperature, you get a glorious bright red, and that's what the officers used. This is the way the wool comes off the sheep. Not near so appealing. It smells like sheep. It's got all the burrs in it that the sheep went through. And so we're going to have to pick this apart in order to get it clean and ready to use. And this is what the children would do. This is a children's job. From the time they were old enough to sit still, they could sit and pick apart the fleece and get it all picked apart so that all the weeds fall out. They could use a pair of hand cards to make it get nice and fluffy. And then when the children were about 6 years of age, the girls were old enough to start spinning on the spinning wheel, and the boys were old enough to start helping Dad out in the shop. So if the girls were spinning, and they would continue spinning till they got to be of marriage age and gone. If they didn't go out and get married, they were the old spinsters.
My name is Sarah, and I'm making pockets today. They're very important to the lady on the frontier because everything is kept in them that she needs. Her sewing items, maybe a little knife to kill a snake. And also, making pockets was a teaching tool for young girls to learn all the stitches, applique, embroidery, regular stitching, and if they did well with that, they might move on to their own clothing. I have other pockets to show. This is a fancy one for Sunday. This is a piece of my skirt I had to tear off that I wouldn't throw anything away, so it's a pocket being made into another pocket. This is how children learn to quill, make quill pieces. These are all tiny scraps which would never be thrown out.
Hello, welcome to Oliver Miller Homestead. I'm welcoming you to our spring house. What we do is we have a lot of good things that we do that Mother makes sure that we're fed well in the morning, and it's very morning. Sometimes it isn't even light out. And what she does is she gets up and she prepares our breakfast. And our breakfast consists of boiling the water and Mother milking the cow. And when she milks the cow, she uses that for making mush. We also have cornbread, and we grind it up and we put it in the beehive oven. And we also have rye bread, which we grind up and we put it in the beehive oven. And we also have bacon, and we have pork, of which is probably ham. And what we do is we make butter. We chur the butter, and then we put it in a pot in the 55-degree water that stands that way from over the hill, up the hill 200 years ago. And we put it in the water, And the water is pure water that we can drink, and we can put our different potatoes, carrots, onions, whatever case it may be. We cannot keep the butter more than 3 days. And being 9 children, we can also have many times where the children can help with the chores for mother. She works very hard, and when we have the cornbread and the bread, the rye bread, it's good for the farmers in our immediate area because a lot of them can't cook the breads that we have. It's 55 degrees water, and the water runs from up over the hill 200 years ago all the way down to Catfish Run, which is down at the end of the property.
I'm demonstrating. I'm the mother or the older sister. This is how literacy was done back in the 18th century. The children would learn how to read using a horn book. A horn book was a wooden board with alphabet letters, vowel sounds, beginning sounds, and the Our Father. They'd practice reading these letters. Then they would use a slate to write the letters on or the words on. And from this they would learn how to read. At least they'll learn how to read their name, or days of the week, or the months of the year. If they'd get really good, the father would read the Bible to them. That's probably the only book they had in the house. They also had this Pittsburgh Gazette. This is from Pittsburgh. This is from 1794. They could also learn some words from here. For math, I'm showing that they would use the nuts to count with and the beans, and these are corn cob pieces. With these, they can learn how to add, subtract, multiply, and all different kind of math skills. They could also write them on their slates, simple math problems. The last thing I want to show you is a church baby. The church baby was a very small toy they would give to the girls or boys during church because they were very quiet. If they drop them on the seats, they wouldn't make any noise. It was a very different lifestyle back then. They had very few books, but they did have the horn book.
Welcome to my garden. I'm so glad that you could come here today and visit with me. This is my medicinal garden, and it's extremely important to my family. Perhaps not as important as a vegetable garden that feeds our family, but it has its importance. We don't have any doctors around here, unfortunately, and so we have to rely on the herbs that we grow. Many of the herbs that I have here came from seeds that my mother had passed on to me when I was a young girl. That was a very important thing and a wonderful gift when you get married. Once you're given these seeds, you're also given the knowledge of how to plant them, how to use them. Luckily for me, my mother knew how to read. Some of the women around here don't know how, their mothers didn't know, and so they weren't taught. But my mother, fortunately, did know how to read, and she was able to take the time to teach me. And so because of that, I did not have to memorize how to use all these herbs. I was able to put it in my book. This is my receipt book. My father, long time ago, when I was of marrying age, made this for me so that I could write everything down that I would need. You have to be so careful with herbs. Sometimes you use the leaves, and sometimes you use the root. And if you do the wrong thing, it can harm your loved ones greatly. And so it was so important for us to know what we were doing. And so our mothers had us work alongside of her in the gardens each year until we knew what we needed to know about them. Now, when my family and I came here, there were many new plants that I didn't know anything about. And so once we were able to connect with our neighbors, they told us that the local Indians taught them how to use some of the herbs and things that grew wild here. And so we have added those also to our garden. And in the same respect, I share my seeds with all the women that are around here. And so we're here to support each other and help each other take good care of our families, which is so important. But we do hope someday to have a doctor nearby that will come in and help our children also. But in the meantime, we have our gardens, and it's what helps take care of them. So I appreciate you coming. Thank you for stopping by at my garden, and I hope you come back soon.
I am the librarian of the Oliver Miller Homestead Associates. My job is to keep a library of books that were written either during the Whiskey Rebellion or deal with the people who lived in that era. I have tried to get books on early women, what it was like to live an existence of having 10 children on a farm and no help, and trying to feed them and raise them. The books I have here today, some of them are early. My earliest book here today was written by some of the men who wrote about the Whiskey Rebellion right after it happened. I have early cookbooks to show you what it was like to cook with ingredients that you could find in those days. I have books here on what it was like for childbirth, child rearing, what it was like. There were still Indians in this part of Pennsylvania. I have one book on a woman who was captured by the Indians. This is a true story. It is called Follow the River. If you ever want to read an interesting book, this is written by James Alexander Thom. It's called Follow the River. It's the true story of a young mother who had a baby and was captured by the Indians, and she decided she was going to go home. And it's her trip following. She knew if she followed the river, no matter how many weeks it took her, she could eventually find her way home, and she does.
I'm in the process of teaching this young lady how to operate a flintlock long rifle in case that we are away for whatever reason. The ladies need to understand how to operate a firearm so to be able to protect themselves in the frontier. So Emily's will show us what she's been learning today. She's going to half cock the rifle, push the frizzen forward. She's going to load the pan with powder. She's going to close the pan. Now she's ready to load the rifle itself. Going to take out a cartridge. We have not loaded it with the ball because the actual target practice will come after she's gotten proficient with loading the rifle. Powder down the barrel. A small piece of the cartridge paper to act as a wad for the powder. As you can see, it's not a quick process, so it takes some practice to get proficient. Now she's going to cock the rifle and she's going to fire. Fire in the hole!
Today we have Lynn Palin with us. Lynn is going to share some of her experiences and some of her memories of what it was like to be a woman on the frontier in a dramatic monologue titled, I Look Back at My Life.
Well, good day. It's so nice to see you all. I was just doing a little stitching. It does bring back memories. I recall when girls got to be a certain age, they'd start thinking on marriage. We all did a lot of that. And then it was time to start thinking about piecing our quilts to take into our new married life with us. The way I did mine was real nice, I think. Papa had laid up an arbor a ways back from the house using the brush we had cleared from the land. Well, I just took my pieces out there and sat in the fresh air and quiet and took to quilting. One day, I was under that arbor, a spring day, beautiful day, May 6th it was, just stitching and dreaming a dream on every stitch about who might share that quilt with me, dreaming about the caring that happens when two become one, when this fine, deep voice says, "Pardon me, ma'am, but I've been watching you for weeks, and I just worked up my nerve to come and talk to you, to see what it is you're working on with such care." Lordy, he'd been watching me for weeks. Well, as it turned out, he's the one who shares that quilt with me. And now that I think about it, to this day, that was the longest speech he ever gave at any one time. So, I sure you know, without me telling you, life can be hard. You don't always have control over the way things go. Sometimes drought or insects will steal the harvest, or fire burn you out. It's just what happens. And then you're only given so much to work with in a life, and you have to do the best you can with what you have. It seems to me that's what piecing quilts is like. You're given fabric from friends and family, or it's all you can afford to buy, and you just make do. But in life and in quilting, the way you put the pieces together is all up to you. You know, by the time I was a grown woman, starting a family of my own, I remember my mama telling me it took her over 25 years to finish one of her quilts. Can you imagine? Well, she could only work on it now and again after all her other work was done. And I can tell you, all her other work was considerable. Sometimes she'd be so bone tired she couldn't fall asleep, or she had something on her mind she needed thinking on, then she would just take up her quilting. Well, she said it felt like all her life was in that quilt. It knew so many of her unspoken feelings. When she was proud of my brothers, it was there in that quilt. And when she was annoyed with them, she knew exactly where those stitches were. The stitches carried the memories of us girls when we made her angry or gave her a warm feeling around her heart. And Papa, too, he was in that quilt, and almost all the 30 years that they were married. She said sometimes she sat there loving him, and sometimes she sat there hating him. She said the quilt seemed to hold her in place, much like the stitches held the fabric in place. Said if she hadn't been planning and working on that quilt, she might have been planning on how to leave. Her hopes and fears, joys and sorrows, her loves and hates were in that quilt. She said sometimes it scared her to think all that quilt knew about her. You know, if you have never needed to do so, I don't reckon you can quite understand how almost everything that we have comes from the work of our hands and the sweat of our brows. We learn to use and reuse everything that the Lord had seen fit to give us. And that includes our fabric. Our quilts are generally a mix of new fabric and old pieces from clothing, outgrown or too worn to wear, but we save pieces just fine for quilting. Though new fabric was and is a wonder, I have always loved the old fabric. bits of shirts from my brothers and Papa. Lovely old pieces from dresses, especially those from my sisters, who I never saw again once we came west. Gown fabric from some of my babies who left this earth too soon. Well, it was like all of these folks were sharing a piece of themselves with me. When one of Mama's quilts was plumb worn out, I saved a few precious pieces and sewed them into a quilt that I was making, a quilt that got passed down to my daughter, along with the stories about the fabrics and our friends and family. And now, well, one of my granddaughters is piecing her quilt. She's using new fabric and old fabric from friends and family. So some of it is bright and new, and some is so faded, it's hard to tell what color it was to begin with, but I hope that she remembers the stories long after the quilts are gone. I was going to say, I hope she remembers the good times and the laughter, and I do. But there is something to be said for passing along all the stories, the good times, the trials, the disappointments, because you know, all the stories help you know who you have come from and what they held dear. And sometimes that can be such a comfort. I have heard it said that the happiest people are not those with the most, but those who are grateful for what they have and can enjoy the simple pleasures in life. Now, I guess you can see I am not a fancy lady, and all my life I have done the best I could with what I had. We worked hard from the time we were little. The girls helping Mama with her vegetable garden and her herb garden, the herbs to flavor our food and also to help with sicknesses. Mama showed us how to clean, to sew, to weave, to dip candles, make soap, oh, so much more, sometimes even helping the boys out in the fields. There was not a lot of time for play, but one thing I did do was make corn husk dolls. It's kind of amazing to think that you could use a corn husk and come up with so many different looking dolls. Now, I am not putting myself on an equal footing with the Almighty, but I was creating, and I just naturally thought about the Bible creation story as I worked. From the husk, I fashioned the head and arms and legs. I took the longest strands of corn silk to make a fine head of hair, the morning and evening of the first day of creation. I called my first doll Cornelia. Cornelia. And I made her a little hat of dried wildflowers and gussied it up with chicken feathers. Then I took a bigger feather and I whittled the quill to a point and dipped it in berry juice to draw on her face. 2 eyes and a tiny mouth that I imagined spoke only light, sweet words. A real lady. The morning and evening of the second day of creation. Later on, most of the dolls that I made used the corn husk for dresses, but Mama saw how careful I was being with that first doll, and she gave me scraps from her quilt piece and bag. Well, now that I think about it, I'm sure it was Mama's way to help me practice sewing by putting those little scraps together. But I was just so excited and grateful because I knew how precious those pieces of fabric were to Mama. That doll was going to be something special with a fabric gown. Then I got the idea she should have a husband, so I quick whipped up a Cornelius doll. And on the third day of creation, I got them wedded and blessed. And on the fourth day and the fifth day and the sixth day, there would be little corn cob nubbins for babies. and on the seventh day they rest. Well, I found that I enjoyed the making of the dolls as much or more than the playing with them. So whenever I could find time and materials, I would make more for my sisters and friends. I was so happy to be creating something that somebody could enjoy. I feel the same today when I can make a meal that gives someone nourishment and pleasure. And that can be hard to create sometimes with the scarcity of food and time that befall us now and then. I think that keeping a well-ordered house and piece and quilts for warmth and a bit of color is part of my creating too. I think that I am doing what the Almighty finds pleasing. At least I hope so. Now, I feel I best tell you, I have not always been so content with my lot in life. I admit I railed against living around certain folks and having to leave family and friends and travel west and, well, just not having more comforts in my life. But you know, I found that fighting against your fate doesn't bring you happiness, just more pain on top of what you already have. And fear? I've had plenty of that too, in lots of ways. It's a hard traveling companion on life's road, and one that is better to lay aside, but not always so easily done. Sometimes you can overcome the fear, and sometimes you are just given the strength to keep moving on. But one day, you look and, well, you are surprised to see that you have come a good piece down life's road. You can be grateful for what you have learned and those who have helped you along the way. You know, some people get old and wise, and some people just get old. We could do with some more of the wise ones. Well, thank you so much for spending time with me. I have been carrying on. I best get back to my work. I wish you safe travels, and please come back again. You'd be welcome.